2015, and you're joining us for our Friday evening LaRouche Pack webcast. My name is Jason Ross, and I'll be moderating this evening. I'm joined in the studio by LaRouche Pack's Matthew Ogden and by EIR Economics' Paul Gallagher. We've spoken with LaRouche pretty extensively over the past couple of days, and the discussion that you're going to hear tonight will reflect that. This morning we posed the following institutional question to Mr. LaRouche, and I'll ask Matthew Ogden to deliver Mr. LaRouche's response. The question on the recent ISIS events is, Mr. LaRouche, an ISIS video showing the horrific killing of a Jordanian Air Force pilot has stoked anger in the Arab kingdom and left analysts wondering what impact it will have on the U.S.-led coalition fighting the militant group. Moaz al-Qasasbeh, 27, was burned alive while confined in a cage. Behind his military postures was a devout Muslim who memorized the Quran and hailed from a larger family and prominent tribe noted for its loyalty to the Jordanian monarchy. Al-Qasasbeh's fate has been a mystery since last December, when his aircraft crashed during a mission and he was reportedly captured. In response, Jordan executed two prisoners, Sajida al-Rishawi, a would-be suicide bomber whose release ISIS had previously demanded as part of a prisoner exchange, and Ziad Karbouli, a former top aide to the deceased leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. The family of a Jordanian fighter pilot mercilessly killed by ISIS is calling for total revenge. The pilot's father is demanding his country do more. Mr. LaRouche, in your opinion, did ISIS make a fatal mistake by burning Moaz al-Qasasbeh, and could this turn the Arab Sunni population against the Salafi jihadists? So, we'll hear from Matthew Ogden.
Thank you, Jason. I think it could be said that the real war against ISIS is being fought in a very real sense and will be decided here in the United States. This is a political war against those such as Obama, who would continue to try to cover up and protect the role of Saudi Arabia in creating the phenomenon that we now know of as ISIS today. And it's only once we win that political war that we'll truly be able to defeat what the threat of ISIS is and what ISIS represents in the world at this time. And I think a critical turning point in that war came just this past week. I think, as many of our viewers probably know by now, the story of the 28 pages has now broken very prominently into the national eye with a front page article that appeared in the New York Times not only once but twice this week, with an article that was published this past Tuesday on the release of the deposition by Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker, which was headlined, "Moussaoui calls Saudi princes patrons of al-Qaeda." And then a follow-up article that was published yesterday, which was headlined, "New Light Cast on Secret Pages in September 11th Report, Tracing al-Qaeda Funding, Claims of Saudi Links Fuel Calls to Release 2002 Document." And as you can see, that's right here on the front page of the New York Times. And the effect of both of these articles this week has been that this fight around the 28 pages has now really reached the point of no return. The genie cannot be put back in the bottle. And as much as Obama would like to try to make this issue go away, it won't. And the timing really couldn't have been better. Now, what Mr. LaRouche said earlier this afternoon was that the critical element in this will be to discredit Obama thoroughly and completely at the deepest level possible and in the most sweeping manner possible. He said that Obama's reputation must be ruined, and his role is nothing but a tool of this entire Anglo-Saudi imperial apparatus must be thoroughly exposed for all to see. And this absolute breakthrough on the 28 pages this week, I think, serves to do exactly that. I mean, what could be more clear? 1 week after Barack Obama cuts short his high-level trip to India to fly to Riyadh with the majority of his administration to practically prostrate himself at the feet of the new incoming Saudi King Salman, what do we read in the official deposition of Zacarias Moussaoui? Moussaoui testifies that prior to 9/11, he was traveling back and forth to Riyadh, acting as a courier, hand-delivering letters and signed checks between none other than Osama bin Laden himself and guess who? Prince Salman, now King Salman of Saudi Arabia. The very same King Salman that Obama made a special trip to Riyadh last week to pay homage to, along with practically the entirety of his administration. And not only is Salman implicated by Moussaoui, but the court papers that were filed along with his testimony also implicate him, Salman, for his role in directing the Saudi High Commission for Relief in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which, according to these court papers, quote, helped fund the very al-Qaeda camps where the 9/11 hijackers received their training for the attacks, and the safe haven facilities in Afghanistan where senior officials such as Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed planned and coordinated the attacks. So is it any wonder that despite all of his promises to the family members of the victims of 9/11 that he would release the 28 pages, Obama has been the primary obstacle standing in the way of this declassification? Or is it any wonder that Obama, at the same time, the Saudi regime continues to be the leading source of funds and inspiration for the jihadi terrorism worldwide today, including inspiration for what ISIS represents? Obama insists on perpetuating the myth that Saudi Arabia is our greatest ally in the region against the war against ISIS today. So these articles that have been released this week in the New York Times actually do precisely make this point and put the issue directly on Obama's doorstep. They cite and quote from both William Doyle, whose son Joseph died in the World Trade Center on 9/11, as well as Kristen Breitweiser, whose husband Ronald was also killed in the Twin Towers, both of whom were promised on 2 separate occasions by Obama personally that he would release the 28 pages. Promises that he's lied about and has reneged upon continuously over the past 6 years, ever since. So the only way that this is going to occur is if there's overwhelming political pressure coming from all sides to bludgeon and force Obama into releasing the 28 pages, where he has no choice but to release these pages. And the stakes really couldn't be higher, and don't kid yourself, Obama will not do this voluntarily. Judging by what was published in Moussaoui's testimony, the release of the 28 pages will serve to begin to unravel not only the entirety of the Saudi terrorism apparatus, but the entirety of the Anglo-Saudi imperial apparatus, without which Obama as a personality virtually doesn't even exist. So, and that's not even to mention the Bush factor in all of this. But I think the image of Obama kissing the feet of the financier of Osama bin Laden, King Salman of Saudi Arabia, I think this would probably be a very useful tool in doing exactly what Mr. LaRouche said to do earlier today, in thoroughly discrediting Obama and ruining his reputation once and for all. And he did this after skipping the march in Paris where dozens of world leaders showed up to march along with the president of France, Francois Hollande, saying, "Je suis Charlie." I saw an appropriate headline this last week that said, "Obama, je suis Abdullah." And I think, Paul, you made the point earlier this week or today that maybe it should have read, "Obama, je suis Osama." Now, although not everything in Moussawi's testimony can be independently verified at this time, we do have confirmation that evidence exists showing that Moussawi did have contact with prominent members of the Saudi royal family, and that his testimony in this regard can and should be taken very seriously. According to Moussawi, he was commissioned by Osama bin Laden personally to compile a computerized database listing all of the financial contributions that Al-Qaeda received. And among those who were entered into that database that Moussawi remembers were Prince Turki Al-Faisal, who was the Saudi intelligence chief at that time, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, who is a Saudi billionaire investor and a member of the royal family, and none other than Prince Bandar bin Sultan, longtime Saudi ambassador to the United States, was the ambassador during the September 11th attacks, and better known as Bandar Bush, the man who was smoking cigars with George W. on the balcony of the White House 2 days after the attacks of 9/11. Now, when the two lead sponsors of HRES 14, which is the congressional bill in the House to declassify the 28 pages, Walter Jones and Stephen Lynch, were interviewed after the release of this testimony, they both confirmed that this is very relevant to what is contained within the 28 pages. Jones said that the Moussawi testimony was similar to what he had seen in the redacted pages, even though he couldn't release details. And according to Fox News, Lynch went so far as to say Moussawi's information, quote unquote, mirrored what he had read in the classified pages about the Saudis' financial connections to the attacks. And just this morning, Congressman Walter Jones wrote a very strong letter to the editor called The Saudis and 9/11, which was published in the New York Times, in which he states that the release of the Moussawi testimony makes it all the more urgent that the 28 pages be released. And Jones explicitly states that much of the content of the 28 pages deals with what he said is the relationship between the Saudis and the Bush administration. He says it twice. This is Walter Jones. Quote, "The contents of the 28 pages do not pose a threat to national security, but deal with relationships that the George W. Bush administration had before 9/11. And then later he says, quote, "Senator Bob Graham has made it clear that the 28 pages deal with the relationship between the Saudis and the Bush administration," unquote. So he really couldn't be more direct. And perhaps even more important than Moussawi's deposition itself are the affidavits that were also filed along with this court document by former Senator Bob Graham, whom people are familiar with from his appearance at the January 7th press conference on Capitol Hill, former Senator Bob Kerrey, and also, very significantly, John Lehman, who was the Secretary of the Navy for 8 years under Reagan. And he was one of the members of the 9/11 Commission, the Citizens 9/11 Commission. So in Graham's affidavit, not only does he go through the details of the San Diego case, which much of which has been presented here during prior webcasts by Jeffrey Steinberg, including the central role of an alleged and highly suspected Saudi government agent named Omar al-Bayoumi in assisting the two hijackers who arrived in California in coordination with the Saudi consulate in Los Angeles and the Saudi embassy in Washington. But also, Graham in this affidavit goes through new developments connected with the Sarasota case, which the FBI stonewalled on, withholding 80,000 pages of documents from an official congressional investigation, which is a very serious crime, until a federal judge forced them to turn these documents over. And these documents are still under review, but we'll see what these release. And then in John Lehman's affidavit, being one of the members of the 9/11 Commission, he states that not only is it a lie that the 9/11 Commission exonerates the Saudis from culpability in the 9/11 attacks, as they try to claim, but he said that he has read the 28 pages and said, quote, "I believe that the disclosure of those 28 pages from the Joint Inquiry Report would greatly assist policymakers and the public in better understanding many of the threats we now confront," which obviously applies directly to the question of the threat of ISIS, which was raised by the questioner that we heard just now. So I think in answer to this question, it couldn't really be better said than what Senator Graham said during his January 7th press conference speech, in which he said he's confident that the United States can militarily defeat ISIS in the field, as well it should. But, quote, "If we think that this is the definition of victory, we are being very naive. ISIS is a consequence, not a cause." And he said ISIS is a consequence of the fact that we have had sustained passivity towards Saudi Arabia, that we've covered up their role in 9/11 over two successive presidential administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and that even if ISIS is crushed, but the source of ISIS is not shut down, then there will just be another organization that emerges and takes its place. Now, just to conclude, I would only add to that by saying that not only do we have to shut down the Saudis, but if we really want to stop ISIS and shut down not only international terrorism as such, but what subsumes it, which is the current drive towards thermonuclear war, which Obama represents, you have to go one step further. Yes, we have to do what Mr. LaRouche said to do. We have to discredit Obama. We have to ruin him. We have to take him out of the position of authority in policy decisions in the United States. Take his finger off the thermonuclear button. But you also have to ask yourself the question, are the Saudis lone actors? Absolutely not. Is Obama a lone actor? Absolutely not. They're both creatures of the British Empire. And I think you can see this clearly if you just look at how both of them relate to the British monarchy. There's pictures of Prince Philip, Prince Charles traveling to Saudi Arabia. You saw what Obama did when he traveled to London. These are nothing but two servants of the same master. And I think when Senator Graham made the point during his speech at the January 7th press conference to go back and cite what he called the perfidy of the British Empire in supporting the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War, not only was he making an ideal historical parallel to 9/11 and our response at that time versus our response at this time, but I think that his remarks contained a much deeper element of truth as well that applied directly to the present day. As we've elaborated in previous webcasts over recent weeks, the release of the 28 pages will also provide the thread which can be pulled to unravel the identity of the true role of the British as being the mother of international terrorism, as a tool of irregular warfare. Not terrorism in and of itself, but irregular warfare. This can be exposed, this can be unraveled. Not only do we have the element of Londonistan, as it's called, but also, parallel with this cover-up of the 28 pages, we've had the cover-up of the Al Yamama scandal the deal between the Saudis and the British arms company BAE. This investigation was personally shut down by Tony Blair, who intervened on it and said, go no further under the Official Secrets Act. So under this agreement between the British Aerospace Company and Saudi Arabia, as Jeff Steinberg has documented on previous webcasts in this forum, you had a covert offshore slush fund that was set up in order to finance irregular warfare and black operations worldwide. So there's a strong reason to suspect also that some of the money that was used to finance 9/11 was generated, at least in part, through this Anglo-Saudi channel. So as I said, the case for British culpability in financing terrorism has been well documented by EIR and research conducted by Jeffrey Steinberg and others, and has been presented previously on this broadcast. So I think if you really want to stop terrorism and war, you have to go to the source. Saudi Arabia, indeed. But Saudi Arabia might be the midwife of international terrorism today, but the mother is the British Queen.
Well, that's certainly a gruesome image. Well, let's take a look at another region of the world, one that's being used to ignite what would become thermonuclear war between the United States and Russia. Let's look at Ukraine. Previously, the U.S. and allies had had a posture of providing non-lethal defensive assistance to the Kiev regime. And that is set to transform, if some are to be believed, to one of providing lethal defensive assistance. Whatever that, well, I'll tell you what that means. It means weapons. Now, the number of dead there continues to increase, and the impossibility of a military solution that will result in a victory for Kiev is becoming more and more apparent to level-headed thinkers. Yet NATO is pushing the incredibly provocative policy of setting up new command centers in Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Look at those on a map. As well as new regional headquarters in Poland and Romania. And Ashton Carter and John Kerry are speaking about the lethal aid, the necessity for this to be provided to Ukraine. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Alexander Lukashevich responded to this discussion saying, quote, "Without a doubt, if such a decision to provide weapons is realized, it will cause colossal damage to U.S.-Russian relations, especially if the residents of Donbass start to be killed by American weapons." This push for war, for arming Kiev, it's far from universal among NATO. Today, Angela Merkel and François Hollande, after engaging in discussions in Kiev, went to Moscow for 5 hours of discussions and dinner with Putin. There are only preliminary reports on that, so I don't think it's worth saying too much about it. Putin's spokesman had said that they were constructive discussions moving towards implementing the Minsk agreements, and that the three of them, along with Poroshenko, were due to speak by phone on Sunday. But we discussed this earlier today with Mr. LaRouche, and I'd like to ask Matthew to present his analysis.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, essentially, the answer to this question is precisely the same as the answer to the previous one. Obama is the problem. In his capacity as a tool of those who are pushing a war confrontation with Russia, as long as Obama is not brought under control, the short fuse for thermonuclear war is still lit. And thermonuclear war is a war that nobody wins. So Jason's right about growing dissent in Europe for Obama's war policy, and Merkel and Hollande's announcement of a surprise trip to Moscow to meet with Putin is being taken as very significant, since Merkel, although Hollande has been there recently, Merkel has not been to Russia in over a year. So the reports are that they were trying to broker some sort of agreement over Ukraine to cool down the situation there, but offering certain conditions along the lines of the Minsk agreements and other things. But Mr. LaRouche was very emphatic earlier today that despite all of the proposals that Merkel and Hollande are bringing to the table with them in Moscow, none of these will work unless the Nazis who are now running Ukraine are eliminated. Mr. LaRouche said, you've got to get rid of the heirs of Adolf Hitler who are now still living in Ukraine to the present day. Unless you do that, there is no guarantee that you've solved this crisis. And Mr. LaRouche said that the Russians have to upgrade their demands and say, the Nazis have to go, that's our precondition, or else nothing. And as we've gone through in detail, these are the direct heirs of the Banderists, the followers of Stepan Bandera in Ukraine, who were allies of Adolf Hitler during World War II, and were personally involved in a lot of the genocide that occurred in this region. These were the networks that, instead of being shut down after the end of the Second World War, were picked up by Alan Dulles, by British intelligence, by German intelligence, and rehabilitated to be used later in a fight, in a future war against Russia. And that war is now. That's exactly how they're being used today. And unless this factor is eliminated, there can be no peace in this region. Now, what does this mean? It means that Victoria Nuland has got to go. Victoria Nuland was the one who personally oversaw this operation to run a coup against a democratically elected government and using Svoboda and right sector thugs who are explicit about their neo-Nazi ideology. Victoria Nuland, Mrs. Robert Kagan, who represents the continuity from the Bush-Cheney administration to the Obama administration. No matter how much she tries to insist that what happened in Ukraine was some sort of great democratic movement, and to deny the fascist factor of what happened in the Euromaidan, as she did just last week at an event at Brookings in Washington, the facts stand on their own. Remember, Obama explicitly admitted in an interview with CNN a week ago that the United States had, quote, brokered the transition of power in Ukraine. How much more explicit can you get? And Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia replied to this saying, look, if somebody needed confirmation that the United States directly from the very beginning was involved in a coup against that government, for which Obama used the neutral term transition of power, it has now been stated. And remember, the Russians have been very public in saying that they view these colored revolutions as nothing less than acts of aggressive war. And it's not just now colored revolutions and economic sanctions anymore. As Jason mentioned, you've got the Obama administration explicitly discussing sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. You've got NATO sending rapid response teams right into the Baltic states, setting up command and control centers right along the Russian border. You still have the ballistic missile defense encirclement. It's the case that there are numbers of leading people inside Europe who are now starting to see that the direction that this is going is towards total war. That's actually the words that President Hollande used when he announced that he was traveling to Moscow to meet with Putin. You've had warnings from former senators Sam Nunn and Lugar on this, from former Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov, and even from former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, all of them warning that this policy is leading inevitably towards thermonuclear war. And thermonuclear war is a completely different beast than conventional war. Thermonuclear war is a war that nobody wins. Now, just to conclude, I also want to just say that there's a broader point here, and I think Mr. LaRouche has been very explicit about this in the recent weeks, that the root cause of this drive for war at this time is the complete and utter bankruptcy of the transatlantic financial system. This system is collapsing while you have an entirely different system being led by over half of humanity rising and coming into being to take its place. After cannibalizing any means of productivity, any real capability of this economy to reproduce itself physically over the last 50 years and replacing it with gambling, with speculation, especially since the time that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, this entire system has now reached endgame. And there's no way of saving it in its present form. And you've got an oligarchical ideology which still exists, which says, just like Zeus said, après nous le déluge, right? After us, the flood. After us, nothing. A bunch of lunatics who would actually be willing to destroy the human race than to see a new system, such as the BRICS, rise and take their place. So the only way to stop this drive towards war, and this is similar to the answer to the previous question, actually, is to confront the causes and not just the effects. Shut down this entire system, put it out of its misery. And to do that, you very simply have to just say the truth. All you have to say is this system is bankrupt, and there's no way that it can continue to survive. And so therefore, what we're going to do is use the constitutional, legal means of national governments, powers of national governments, to place this entire system through a top-down, orderly reorganization. And this means writing off large amounts of this completely unpayable gambling debt and creating an entirely new system to replace it. I know this is something that Paul is going to take up in much more detail. Let me just say, this was a point that Helga LaRouche made very clearly in an interview that she conducted just last weekend while she was in Copenhagen, Denmark, doing an event on the New Silk Road special report that's been published by Executive Intelligence Review, and she was interviewed by TASS, the official news agency of the Russian Federation. And they quote her saying the following. This is Helga LaRouche. Right now, you have a growing chorus of eminent strategists in the West who are warning of the immediate danger of a third world war. Since the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1999, which eliminated any banking regulation, the world has fallen into the hands of predators who enrich the few at the expense and suffering of billions of human beings, with the help of a financial system that has essentially become a big casino. There is an enormous, unpayable derivatives debt, which is the real cause of the war danger, unquote. And this is really coming to a showdown point at this moment in Greece, which I know will be the subject of our next question. The point that Mr. LaRouche made earlier this afternoon is that we have the responsibility to provide real leadership both in this country and in internationally. And if we can recreate the image of what Alexander Hamilton did, what Abraham Lincoln did, especially what Franklin Roosevelt did, in the greatest moments of our history, Mr. LaRouche said, then we can awaken the sleeping giant, which is among the American people. And I know that's going to be a theme that we'll be continuing to elaborate over the coming week, going all the way into the President's Day conference next weekend, next Saturday, up in New York City.
All right, thanks, Matt. So for the final topic of the evening, we'll take up the potentially enormous changes in the world that can be catalyzed by the actions of the new Greek government. The new ruling party, Syriza, ran on an anti-austerity platform. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras welcomed the newly sworn-in parliament members just recently. He said, "We must all be proud to participate in the process of the emancipation of the Greek people. The Greek people are making history because they are determined to support the major changes, the necessary reforms to the end of the client state." Speaking of the election on January 25th, he said, "You should feel proud, because on January 26th, the citizens of this country could breathe and be filled with confidence. Dignity and democracy have returned. Discussion of debt relief, along the lines of the incredibly successful 1953 London Debt Conference, that's brewing, as it's simply impossible for Greece to make good on its debt levels, and the austerity demanded by the EU, by the Troika, is ravaging the economy rather than creating the conditions for future wealth. Apparently, the European Union and Brussels, or Britain, didn't get the memo about the changes in Greece, and they're insisting that no debt relief will be given, that Greece must abide by all contract agreements, that the European Central Bank will not accept Greek bonds, that elections simply don't matter. Mr. LaRouche had some powerful remarks on this front when we spoke earlier today, and I'll ask Paul Gallagher to present his thoughts on this.
This is a really crucial question, and I start directly from where Matthew left off, because this opens up the question, this fight between the presence of a new Greek government elected in the way that you just indicated, on the basis of promises to end absolutely deadly austerity in that country, and its fight now with the European, that is London-centered, European mega banks with their 2 trillion or so euros of unpayable bad debt. This fight opens up the possibility, and this is something that Lyndon LaRouche has been saying for weeks now, before they got elected, that it opens up the possibility of reversing the collapse of the European economies and restoring the sovereignty to the European countries. And in addition, it opens up the possibility of a new system, and by that he does not mean a new ideological system, but a new system of cooperation between the transatlantic countries, the United States as the leading one, and the countries of Europe, which have been put in essential ruination, economic collapse by these banks. The possibility of a new system in which they collaborate with the BRICS, particularly with China and India and Russia, in a broad Eurasian development, and in a new international cooperation for increased productivity, increased overall infrastructure investment, the frontiers of science, greatly increased exploration of the solar system, led by the example right now of the Chinese lunar program, which is really the leading science program of that kind in the world. These are all implicitly bound up in the fight which this new Greek government has found itself in against the so-called European institutions, really the London and Brussels institutions, which represent these mega banks, not only of Europe but also of Wall Street. It's really one system. We know that from the fact that most of the money that the Federal Reserve printed to bail them out went to the banks in Europe, and a minority of it went to the Wall Street banks. That's the way it was. The European economies, the nation's economies, are in a kind of death spiral because the bankruptcy of the transatlantic banking system, and they have been crushed since the Berlin Wall fell by the imposition of this euro single currency, with the treaties that went with it, with the extreme limitations that were placed on Germany's growth in particular, but really all of these countries' growth, by the British, by Thatcher, George H.W. Bush, and Francois Mitterrand, working in combination to keep Germany down, as they put it, even as they allowed it to reunify under certain conditions. This euro single currency has crushed their economies since then, and these new institutions are a chance for these nations to join up with the BRICS nations, particularly China, India, Russia, in Eurasian-wide development, particularly infrastructure development, which I'll describe a little later. I also want to make clear why all this requires that the Glass-Steagall Act, or its equivalent, be reenacted in the United States and also imposed as regulation on these banks in Europe. Now, in Greece, the Greek debt absolutely cannot be paid. The amount of money which Greece is expected to pay to the IMF and to the European Central Bank alone in the next 6 to 7 months is 19 billion euros. If you compared it on the basis of their budget and our budget, this would be like the United States paying in a single year 1.3 to 1.5 trillion dollars of debt service. In other words, 6 to 7 times what we actually pay in a year's time is what we would have to pay in 6 months. Greece cannot, will not, is not going to do this. Secondly, much of this debt resulted from, first of all, Greece having to take back fraudulent derivatives contracts that were concocted for it by Goldman Sachs Bank and other Wall Street banks in order to get it into the EU, the European Union, in the first place. Secondly, more importantly, that debt of Greece came from bailing out large banks, not only Greek banks, but other European banks as well. In fact, just yesterday, a global study was published which showed that the primary debts worldwide had grown since the crash of these debts 6 years ago, had grown by another $57 trillion to about $200 trillion overall. That the debts of the banks in that period of time had changed almost not at all, and that the debts of the governments had grown by more than $30 trillion. Why? Because the governments assumed the liabilities of the banks. The governments bailed out the banks, taking on the debt in order to do that, and the banks shed the losses from their bad loans, their bad assets, onto the governments, resulting in the incredible new indebtedness of these governments. In Greece, this is the case in spades. Thirdly, Greece cannot continue its bailout, so-called, either. This is the bailout with the conditions which have plunged Greece into mass unemployment, resulted in mass emigration of young people from Greece, fired doctors and nurses and closed hospitals on a mass scale, caused mass unemployment, and also sharply raised taxes on Greek people, and not only on those who are still working, because the taxes that have been sharply raised have been continually shifted to those kinds of taxes that everybody has to pay, real estate and so forth, increased water charges, to the point where the death rate has increased in Greece while the birth rate has decreased. The suicide rate has increased explosively and has even included people publicly immolating themselves in despair over the condition into which the country and the people were being plunged, and has caused this mass immigration. So the idea of extending the bailout is also an impossibility. So what's the alternative? You hear that Greece's debt is 175% of its gross domestic product. That's certainly high. But back in 1952, in the problem that Jason referred to, which has been posed as the alternative, Germany's debt at that time was 280% of its gross domestic product. This was debt that went back to Hitler and the Nazis and back into the 1920s, to the Dawes Plan. And in spite of the fact that the Marshall Plan had started generating new credit in the German economy, it was being crushed by this dead debt. And a debt conference was held on American initiative in London in 1952. It became known as the London Debt Conference of 1953 because it took that long for them to come to finally the final plan. But in 1953, they wrote off, that is, said would not be paid 62% of all of the debt of Germany, $16 billion out of $28 billion. At that time, a great deal of debt was written off. And even the further payment by Germany of the remaining debt was made conditional 5% of its export earnings in a given year, no more. And that was stuck to. That was complied with. The German economic miracle followed. And as I said, the new credit institutions were there in the Marshall Plan aid and in the creation of the KfW Bank, which translates as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation Bank of Germany. Those credit institutions were essential to what happened, but it would not have happened had this, Germany would not have become the great economic power of Eurasia in the ensuing period had it not been for this write-down of the debt. So the same kind of debt conference is proposed now for Greece, and not only for Greece, but for at least half a dozen very heavily indebted European countries whose economies are being crushed by it. This debt absolutely has to be written down. Where did they get this crushing debt? They got it from bailing out their banks. Take Ireland. Ireland's debt before the bailout of its mega banks, which were really London banks in Ireland, before that bailout, Ireland's debt was about 25% of its GDP. After that bailout, it was 125%, roughly, of its GDP. Living standards were reduced, wealth was destroyed, 150,000 Irish people out of 4 million emigrated. This is just in the last few years. So now this debt conference and debt write-down for these most indebted countries, initiated by the new Greek government. And economists all over the world have supported it. Parties in other European countries have supported it. A week ago, 300,000 people rallied in the Central Square in Madrid in support of it. Yesterday, again, 100,000 people rallied in the Central Square in Athens in support of this. But the so-called European financial institutions, that is the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, what's called the Eurogroup, the finance ministers of the major European countries, are all saying, no, absolutely not. The debt must be upheld, and even if we're going to consider more extending and pretending about this debt, that is, extending it further out into the future and pretending that you're going to pay it, even if we are going to do that any longer, we demand even more austerity from Greece and other heavily indebted countries as a condition for that extend and pretend. Merciless, impossible, essentially fascist demands. This is, in addition, also suicidal policy, because Europe is in a permanent recession since 2008. A depression, really, you call it a not-so-great depression, and it will get worse until the Eurozone breaks up. Now, what the view of Lyndon LaRouche and those of us working with him, his associates who are working along with him and with Helga LaRouche in order to change the framework of economic policy direction entirely, in order to make this kind of new alliance that I described at the beginning, have basically this approach to this, that the Greek proposal to reorganize its debt is necessary not only for it, but for Europe as a whole in order to revive. This hard line coming from the European Union, the European Central Bank, the IMF, is suicidal. In fact, today, the European Central Bank has gone so far as to give Greece 10 days more to apply to extend its bailout. In other words, to apply for the extend and pretend variant with all of the austerity conditions and more. And if it doesn't do so within 10 days, it is cut off from every form of European central credit, and its banking system is cut off. In other words, it is thrust out of the Eurozone and must reorganize its debt outside the Eurozone, which it will be able to do. But this hard line is suicidal in a number of ways. We have to ask, why was it possible 60 years ago to write off nearly two-thirds of all of the debt of Germany so that Germany could then enter into what came to be called its economic miracle? And why is it now supposedly or apparently impossible for even a much smaller portion of the debt of Greece and Ireland, Portugal, other heavily indebted countries to be written off? The reason is the bankrupt condition of the banks in Europe, the large banks in London and in Europe, and also those of Wall Street, which are already loaded down with bad debts, which they refuse to write off themselves. Secondly, even more importantly, from their deranged standpoint, because for 20 years we have no longer regulated those banks under Glass-Steagall or anything analogous to Glass-Steagall in any other country, which in 1953 and still in 1993 separated and protected the commercial deposit banks from all of this other speculative activity. In other words, because these banks are exposed to the 750 trillion or larger derivatives bubble globally of financial derivatives, bets, side bets on bets, which the banks and the hedge funds and et cetera have made on this debt. And they've made it inclusive of on the debt of governments, and everybody, every economist who has an insight into these banks knows that. They have exposed your pension fund, they have exposed your retirement savings, they have exposed your insurance policy to this gargantuan derivatives bubble. And these desperate banks believe that any writing down of debt will explode this gigantic bubble of derivatives. Thus, the hard line. Under President Roosevelt's Glass-Steagall Act and under the copycat laws which were passed in many European countries right after World War II, commercial banks, even the biggest ones, did not have this exposure to the wild derivative and other related speculative bubbles, and therefore it was possible to do the kind of write-down of debt which was essential at that time in the case of Germany. Now, LaRouche's view now is that this debt must be written down, that we cannot honor fictitious debts. This debt is dead, essentially, and collapsing the grotesque derivatives bubble is essential to allow the transatlantic economies to start growing again. The bubble is nothing but unlimited, unregulated gambling, and the gamblers have lost again. So no more bailouts. The Wall Street and London-centered banks are bankrupt, and they themselves have to be reorganized. Restoring the Glass-Steagall Act is the necessary way to do this. It's alive again in the U.S. Congress, in the new 114th Congress. Many officials and political parties in Europe support it, including those which form the new Greek government. So launch that Glass-Steagall reorganization now before another explosion of bankrupt banks makes it too late. But we can't wait for that reorganization to be completed. We have to replace the dead corpse of all this debt with new credit institutions or reformed credit institutions, which are on a national and federal basis and which create a new viable debt. What makes it viable? Because it is extended as credit to the process of reemploying people in productive employment, increasing their productivity, in well-paying employment, and in important investments in the kind of modern infrastructure platforms which make the entire economy more productive, therefore providing the underpinning of new wealth for that viable credit. This has been done before. It's been done repeatedly in U.S. history. Alexander Hamilton did it first. Hamilton's Second National Bank did it again. Lincoln's greenback policy did it again. Franklin Roosevelt's bank reorganization in March of 1933, and then the Reconstruction Finance Corporation did it yet again. So this is not new. The new credit drives a program of productive and reasonably paid employment and builds a new economic platform of modern economic infrastructure on a large scale. Creating, in that way, higher human productivity is the basis of wealth to redeem the viable debt. Now, LaRouche said today this is particularly true for Europe. Trying to bail it out on any piecemeal basis absolutely cannot work. You have to create something new which can integrate it into the great infrastructure investments developments of the Silk Road, which are coming across Eurasia from China and India and Russia. And many of these great projects have been proposed decades ago by Lyndon LaRouche and by Helga LaRouche, and they have worked tirelessly to see them emerge in the new policy from China and from the BRICS, and the BRICS allied, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS allied nations. So create new credit institutions as this dead debt is written off. and as the banks are reorganized through Glass-Steagall restoration, and join those new credit institutions with those which have been recently created, the international development banks, by China and the BRICS countries. Let me just indicate quickly before I close some examples. If you could show that first slide, Spencer, in terms of this progress across Eurasia. This is the broadest of the broad plans, again going back to things that Helga LaRouche was organizing around in Europe and in Asia 30 years ago, and which have become coherently the policy thrust of China. These are high-speed rail lines being built across from Zhengzhou and from Beijing, across all the way to the Atlantic. They've actually gone somewhat further now. That high-speed rail freight connection goes all the way to the Atlantic coast of Spain, and these are lines which are now being used by the major freight transshipment companies, which have their dedicated trains running on them. But this is only part of a vision of what the Chinese call the Silk Road economic belt, of making Eurasia a single new economic platform with really massive investments in this kind of infrastructure. And if you go to the next one, this gives an idea, although it's very dense, nonetheless it gives an idea in Western Europe, Western and Eastern Europe. The red high-speed rail lines and the long blue Rhine-Main-Danube canal running all the way across Europe. These are proposals which are decades old. Again, they were given life by the organizing led by Helga LaRouche 3 decades ago and since, but they are in red because they have not been built. The ones in green are in green because they have been built. They are a very shrunken network, and all of these things were planned 30 years ago. Why were they not built? Because of exactly the Euro system, the limitation on investment of every country in the Euro system, which were placed on by the British, by that agreement between Thatcher, Mitterrand, and George H.W. Bush of the infamous burning Bush family, in order to keep Germany from developing and in order to keep Eastern Europe from developing. These things now have become part of the BRICS view of Eurasian development. If you look down at the lower right-hand corner, there is the Suez Canal, which the Egyptian government under al-Sisi is rapidly doubling so as to make it possible for ships to pass in both directions at once and go through without waiting. This will vastly increase the trade from Asia through the Suez Canal, and if you look right across the Mediterranean from that point, whereas those ships now go all the way out the Mediterranean into the Atlantic and eventually up to Rotterdam, their target will now be Athens. So we get the next slide. And here in Greece is something of which the new Greek government, in this battle for debt renegotiation and for new credit, is very much aware of. That is, that it will become now the front end of Europe from the standpoint of the flow of investment and trade coming from the powers of Asia. And already Chinese investment is going into the development and expansion of the port of Athens, the Piraeus port, and into the development of all of those railroads running north from there into Central and Eastern Europe. So this is already the potential of a partial renovation of the economic platform, the infrastructure platform of all of Europe, already underway as a result of the impulse of the BRICS. And this is what is being striven for in terms of setting up new credit institutions to replace this dead debt with viable employment, a viable debt which leads to employment, productivity, increased living standards in countries whose economies have really been smashed. Just a couple more, and we indicate the same thing is true for the United States, where the banks have, during this same period of time, built up a shale oil bubble, and that's about all they've had to show for themselves over the last 6 years. That bubble is now in serious trouble of blowing up banks on Wall Street because of the Saudi-engineered collapse of the price. And if Spencer, if you could move to the next one, that bubble has prevented, and similar, have prevented investments in this kind of infrastructure. This is an outline. And by the way, these are all from an EIR special report called the Silk Road Becomes the New World Land Bridge, which is an exhaustive report of all of the new infrastructure platforms worldwide, which are being built, which are not, which are planned, how to finance them, what investments are being made. This is a national electrified rail system for the United States. The reason that our rail network is so slow, that the Chinese now will be building rail cars for the Boston subway, and the joke is that those rail cars will be seen running far ahead of the train that they're supposed to be coupled on, because they're used to going at a reasonable rate of speed. But the reason that we don't go at any reasonable rate of speed is that there is no electrified rail in the United States, less than 1% of the network itself having shrunk. There is no investment going on in this. These are the investments that new credit institutions must make. If we show the last one, another fundamental problem of the drought in the western and southwestern part of the United States, which is continuing to intensify, and one way in which it has to be attacked. These are the proposed locations for large-scale nuclear desalination plants, both to produce fresh water and to produce power at the same time, which themselves constitute exactly the kind of investment that these new institutions have to go into. So there's a direct connection here. Those countries in Europe which are fighting the banks over this unpayable dead debt and fighting in the direction of the opening to new credit institutions, these same countries are opposing the moves towards war with Russia and China. They're opposing the sanctions, and the questions really are a single question. So what LaRouche has said is, it's bankrupt. They gambled over and over again. They've lost again. This bankrupt system has to be shut down. The $750 billion trillion dollar derivative bubble cannot be protected. Shut it down. Impose Glass-Steagall regulation to reorganize these banks, but don't wait. Introduce new institutions, as he calls it, buffers of new credit, which can actually revive the optimism of the populations of the European countries that we're talking about right now, and also place them in a new kind of relationship to a new system of cooperation for these purposes with the countries allied with the BRICS. So that's what's at stake in this very hard-fought battle that's going on between the London banks and the new Greek government and those who are backing it in Europe.
Good, excellent. Well, that will draw that'll put a concluding note on the end of our broadcast for tonight. Thank you for joining us. As Matthew had mentioned, next weekend on the 14th, we're going to be having a Schiller Institute conference, which I believe will most likely be streamed live on our site. It will be. And we'll be seeing you before then as well. So thanks for tuning in. Good night.